The truths on which human rights are founded may be held to be self-evident, but it was not always self-evident who would count as human in the 18th century, or even what humanity was. Easy to invoke, but hard to define, the word humanity was throughout the 18th century generally, though not always, used to refer to benevolence in one's relations to others, optimistically considered to be a distinctively human trait. It was also used to refer to the broader class of human beings, but the positive content of the category was much disputed as philosophers, theologians, and natural historians sought both to secure the threshold between human and animal, and to grapple with the distinction of so-called variety internal to the human species. Wherein then would I gladly know consists the precise and unmovable boundaries of that species of man, the philosopher John Locke wrote in 1690. 'Tis plain, if we examine, there is no such thing made by nature and established by her amongst men. Throughout the period, my mimetic definitions of man as a creature fashioned after a divine image smack up against the recognition of the anthropological plurality of different peoples, while taxonomies, such as those of the Swedish natural historian Linnaeus, that sought to isolate stable human traits, reason, speech, bipedality, featherlessness, were challenged by diachronic visions of humanity as a species identified by its reproductive succession across time, as the French natural historian Buffon argued, or as a perfectible work in progress within teleological models of history, as any number of Enlightenment thinkers asserted. The nature of the species, in short, was hard to pin down. Even Linnaeus confessed in a letter that considering man and his body as a naturalist, he had difficulty locating a single distinguishing mark which separates man from the apes, save for the fact that the latter have an empty space between their canines and their other teeth. Writers scrabble for a lowest common denominator of the human that alternately reduces humanity to a poor, bare, forked creature, something perilously close to Hannah Arendt's abstract nakedness of being nothing but human, or worse, produce a definition that dead ends in a tautology. Humanity is what makes humans human, that reveals a curious void at the heart of this immensely powerful abstraction. There are men, as the French grammarian Du Marsay put it in his 1730 treatise on tropes, but humanity does not exist. That is, there is not a being that is humanity, so there's no template. The stakes of these definitional debates about the nature of the human species became particularly fraught at the end of the 18th century, for both the content and the form of these definitions of humanity were both tacitly and explicitly used to justify the fact that in practice, and regardless of these academic squabbles, millions of human beings were seized on as less than human chattel, bought and sold as commodities, and treated like beasts in the Atlantic slave trade. Equally important for our purposes today, the absence of a stable and consistent definition of humanity raised problems for the 18th century rights of man, and by extension, for modern discussions of human rights, which derive their inalienability and inherency from the simple fact that man is man. And that word simple comes up very frequently in human rights discourses and discussions of humanitarianism. For if the great innovation of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was to attach rights specifically to the fact of humanity, rather than rank, religion, property status, occupation, among other things, then the matter of who exactly will be understood to be human would seem to be a question of some urgency. The universal man of the 1789 French Declaration was, of course, grotesquely restricted in its compass, excluding all women, some religious minorities, some men without property, free blacks on French soil, and all enslaved Africans in the colonies, at least at first. But the crucial point here lies in the insistence that humanity could serve as the grounds of rights. Étant hommes, being men, as the Abbé Grégoire put it in his 1789 Motion en faveur des Juifs, they claim the rights of citizens. I want to think about the consequences of these loose and contested definitions of humanity in early discussions of human rights by tracing very briefly, I promise, the manipulation of humanity in the late 18th century British parliamentary debates on the abolition of the slave trade, which, due to their transnational scope and their investment in the category of humanity as such, have been understood as an important precedent both for modern human rights and modern humanitarianism. My interest lies in the centrality of sympathy and sentimental feeling to definitions of humanity, and to the way the compass of the seeming universality of species is redrawn by literary and rhetorical forms in these debates. I'm going to make 3 quick points about the debates and then conclude with 2 brief observations. My first point is simply about historical differences in ways of talking about the human. In the abolition debates, feeling, not reason, not natural history, is the primary way of defining and constituting humanity. And the constituting is important. There's a performative aspect of this language. The parliamentarians call upon a moving repertoire of sentimental and suffering figures in order, as the abolitionist William Wilberforce put it, to gain for these poor creatures the recognition of their human nature. The human nature being recognized proves, however, to be disconcertingly elastic. Sentimental feeling offers a kind of I know it when I see it definition. Although the absence of a categorical definition allows humanity to expand to embrace hitherto excluded populations, it means that specific individuals or groups can be yo-yoed in and out of the human purview on a case-by-case basis. The humanity of the other is only as enduring or as fleeting as the recognition of the metropolitan subject. More insidiously, perhaps, the seeming openness of the category of humanity may operate as a ruse, making humanity into the vessel for an abstract equality that admits rights only insofar as one cleaves to its particular forms of subjectivity or subjection. If you restore, and this is, I'm quoting William Pitt here, if you restore to this degraded race the true feelings of men and place them on a level with the rest of the human species, Pitt puts it, they will work with that energy which is natural to men. So the ascendancy to the status of humanity comes with a price tag. These rights actually wind up constricting people. My second point is about the perils of ignoring literary and rhetorical form. Recent work that has sought to conjoin the habits of sympathy inculcated by popular sentimental texts to the emergence of human rights, and I'm thinking here of work that has stemmed from the work of Lynn Hunt, overstates the case in asserting that sympathetic identification helps engender a belief in political equality or human commonality. These arguments tend to treat sympathy as a kind of automatic habit, fostering a spontaneous overflow of feeling grounded in the recognition of human likeness in another. Sympathy begins at home and moves relentlessly outward, absorbing new populations in its rapaciously benevolent ambit. Yet, as the immense labor of the abolitionists in the debates to stimulate the feelings of their interlocutors show, there is absolutely nothing automatic about sympathy. As Wilberforce puts it, the very circumstances of these poor people being distinguished by their color from the rest of the community prevents their calling forth the feelings of sympathy. They are a marked species, looked upon as a different race of beings. It is not that we have feelings for others because they are human. It is because we have feelings for others that they come to be seen as human. Sentimental feeling, that is, produces humanity. Or rather, it repeatedly denies the already existing humanity of its objects in order to have the pleasure of reinstating that humanity again and again. It thus produces hierarchy and difference as much as it creates reciprocity and likeness. The subjects who sympathize and the objects who elicit sympathy confront one another across an affective and cultural divide in which one set of people feels for, has feelings about, and instead of another. My point is that sentimentality as a literary form, as a rhetorical structure, is designed to produce and police the movement of emotion between feeling subjects and objects of feeling, thus working to weld the affective response to other people to broader structures of human classification. It need not lead to equality or to rights. Third point. The pride of place given to feeling and its handmaidens, suffering and pain, threaten to elide the very distinctions between human and animal that abolitionists sought to assert elsewhere in the debates. Jeremy Bentham's much-quoted assertion that the relevant question governing the treatment of enslaved humans and animals should not be can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer, leaves us with a diluted form of humanity, even animality, defined through a negative capacity, a capacity that is an incapacity, that is the capacity to suffer. One question this raises, and I'm thinking forward to what I hope will be our discussions later today as well in the next session, is whether scholarly attention to the parliamentary debates on the abolition, and I include my own work in this is not attacking anyone else, doesn't repeat the same problem on a historiographical register by blocking out the fact that the recognition of humanity was claimed and also exacted by the resistance and revolutionary action of the enslaved, not graciously bestowed by enlightened parliamentarians. And it's perhaps also worth recalling here the historical irony that abolition gave renewed impetus to the imperial projects of a morally vindicated Britain. Now I'm in closing. Because human rights and humanitarianism are often invoked in Western media in response to violations and abuses, they frequently default, even today, to the sentimental terms of the parliamentary debates with their focus on victimized humanity. The first question I want to raise in closing is whether the very visibility of human rights and humanitarian crises does not train our attention on clearly demarcated causes and effects, while obscuring systemic causes that produce structural inequalities and injustices. The forces, say, of global capitalism that, perverse though this may sound, may curtail human rights before they can get out of the gate to be violated, or of what Rob Nixon has recently called slow violence, the gradual and often invisible ravages wrought by climate change, oil spills, the toxic contaminants of war, which also shape the capacity of individuals and also, importantly, communities to exercise rights. To take into consideration these structural causes is to recognize the way human and non-human are intertwined, as indeed 18th century radical thinkers imagined. And it invites us to ask how this intertwining of human and non-human might affect our understanding of rights and the humanity to which they are assigned. Current discussions of animal rights, environmental activism, and parliaments of things have yielded calls for what might be termed a provincializing of humanity and human rights that would allow for greater attention to the rights of non-humans, rights that may be necessary perhaps to secure and may even need to come before human rights in the stricter sense, understood precisely as those that belong to humanity as a species. So we may need to think about how we're defining humanity. Whether in what sense such rights could or ought to be termed human is, however, a question I leave for discussion. Thank you.
Lynn's just been talking about sentience, so I want to check, first of all, can you hear me? Good. And can you see my PowerPoint? Because I can't. You can, okay.